So guys, some time back, I created a video on this very powerful opening system for black, which was all about the pierce defense. This video has got almost 2.5 million views till now, and you guys really liked it. Now this pierce defense is a really good opening system where white starts with the move pawn to e4. But what about the other popular moves like d4 or the English opening or say knight to f3? Well, to counter all these different moves, today I'll show you the King's Indian opening setup, which is really strong and aggressive. And if you follow this video till the end, you learn a lot of hidden ideas and strategies that will help you get into dominant middle game positions. Before we begin, I would like to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring this video. Okay, now what is the King's Indian setup? Basically, this is what it is. You bring out the knight, Fianchetto the bishop, castle, and then make your king safe. It's a solid structure and that's what you need to do as black. However, there is one thing you need to be careful about. If white starts with e4 and you bring out the knight, he can simply play e5 and that can get a little uncomfortable to deal with. That's why after e4, to stop him from pushing forward, we first played d6, which is the pierce defense. And as discussed, I have made a separate video for that, so do check it out. Now generally, the King's Indian begins with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and now comes e4. The move order could be a little different, but this is the standard position. Remember, we never played d6 because there was no pawn to attack the knight. So the moment he goes e4, we have to play d6. Now knight f3, castles, and we arrive at the same setup. In the King's Indian defense, white has this pawn on c4, whereas in the pierce defense, this pawn is generally not advanced forward. So that's the main difference. Okay, now in the King's Indian, white could play in a few different ways, like all these typical moves shown on the board. We'll try to learn all the important ideas and strategies, and I'll try to keep it as simple as possible so that you can counter all these different variations. Alright, so let's start with the most common classical variation where white goes for knight to f3. We castle, and white's main move here is bishop e2, preparing to castle on the king side. Now if you review all the famous games by Kasparov, Hikaru, Bobby Fischer, you will see that their most preferred move is e5 because they want to break open white's center. But I would like to give you another option. But first, let's look at e5. For starters, you might be wondering white has two attackers but black has only one defender. So how does this even work? Well, if he takes and you take back, and if he captures with the knight, you have this idea of the discovered attack on the knight. So generally, it's better to exchange the queens first. And eventually, you collect the pawn and then the knight. So this is actually better for black. Therefore, in this position, e5 is perfectly fine to play. But in this exchange variation, instead of taking the pawn right away, white can first exchange the queens, and then he has this tricky little move, bishop to g5. Now the main threat is knight to d5, hitting both the pawn and the knight. You can't take because of the pin, and that's why this variation can get a little uncomfortable to play as black. Look, you can play something like rook e8 and that's perfectly fine, but I want to give you a better option. In this position, instead of the immediate e5, you can play the sneaky little move, knight to a6, and after white castles, then you can go for e5. Look at the difference. You have this knight here, and now if he goes for the exchange variation, and after that if he trades the queens, bishop g5 isn't that much of a threat anymore. You can simply play something like h6, and after takes, this knight d5 move is not that problematic because this pawn is now protected by the knight. You can simply go back or play king g7 and you're actually in a better position. So basically, this exchange variation is kind of neutralized by getting the knight here. But that's not the only benefit of playing knight a6. Let's look at another common move that white can play, and that is d5. Now we know that knights on the rim are dim, but this is just temporary. Since white has given up the control of this square, we can get it in the center right away. So remember this, whenever you get the chance, relocate your knight to c5. Okay, so one of the key ideas of playing the classical King's Indian is to first lock down the center, and then as black, we attack on the king side, and white looks to advance on the queen side. If white succeeds, he might gain some material advantage at best, but if you are successful in breaking through on the king side, you'll most likely just checkmate the white king. And that's the biggest reason why we play the King's Indian as black. Now by getting the knight here, we are hitting on e4 with tempo, so he'll have to defend it. And now, as I told you, white wants to expand on the queen side. We call this the bayonet variation, and this is a good counter for white. And many black players don't like to face this. But by playing knight a6 and then knight c5, this gives us just enough time to prevent white from attacking with b4. We play a5, we lock him down and paralyze him so he can't apply pressure on the queen side. and therefore we can now completely focus on the king side and attack him aggressively with our full force. Even if he tries a3 and then b4, in that case also you can simply push forward. And after b4, we have en passant and white is in trouble. Going back, in this position, most probably you will see moves like bishop e3 or bishop g5. With bishop e3, he's trying to get rid of our knight, but you need to know that this is his good bishop. All these pawns are on the light squares, so this bishop is really powerful. Ideally, he should not exchange, but even if he does, that's a good trade for you. I would prefer to play b6 so that after the exchange, you solidify the queen side, making it even more difficult for him to advance. On the other side, you can simply move your knight away and attack on the king side. In this position, even if he plays bishop g5, just kick it away. And after bishop e3, it's the same plan that we saw earlier. Now, I don't want to confuse you with too many variations, but as a general strategy, lock down the center, maneuver this knight so that you can advance these pawns, and follow up with all your pieces behind them to launch a systematic kingside attack. In some variations, you can also do a rook lift like this, which defends these pawns, and then reposition the rook to attack along the king side. Now on similar lines, we also have the Averbakh variation, where after c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, we have bishop e2. Notice he's not playing knight f3. Anyway, we are just going to castle and then bishop g5. And this is the Averbakh variation. To counter this, we'll use the same approach as we saw in the earlier line. We'll keep it consistent so that it's easier for you to remember. So first knight a6 and then we play e5. Now you don't need to worry about d takes on e5 because after takes, queen takes, rook takes, knight d5, and even though you have this spin, you can simply play rook d6 and that's pretty good for black. The knight is defended, the pawn is defended, you're attacking on e4 and you can easily push him back with c6, h6 and the story goes on. So this is something white would not like to get into. Therefore, most probably he will lock down the center with d5. And as you know by now, as soon as he plays d5, he releases the control of this square, so we straight away play knight to c5. This pawn is under attack, so he defends with f3. Not only this, he's also preparing for a king side expansion with g4 and h4. So basically, white is saying, I know you're a King's Indian player, you want to attack my king side, but this time I'll take control and I'll attack your king. But that's absolutely fine. We can still play on the queen side and break the center. Anyway, after f3, remember we cannot let him kick our knight, so we'll play a5. And as soon as he starts advancing on the king side, our plan will be to open up the queen side and just go after his king. By the way, after h6, there is a secret little trap where if he tries to be greedy and takes this pawn, then he's gone. Look, we won't take the bishop. Instead, we have the stunning move, knight takes on e4. And after pawn takes, we have the beautiful queen h4 check. We pick up the bishop and this is an almost winning position for black. So that was the Averbakh variation. Now I have many more important variations to show you, but before that, I would like to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring this video. Guys, just like an intense chess game, life can also be very stressful. Whenever I am in a stressful or anxious situation, I try to distract myself. But most of the times your thoughts are not in your control. That's when you need the help of a professional therapist who can take care of your mental health. Finding the right therapist can be a daunting experience, but BetterHelp makes it very easy for you. Well, BetterHelp is an amazing online platform where you can seek therapy at your own convenience. It's online, it's remote, and just by answering a few questions, you get matched to a suitable professional therapist. The best part is that if you don't really get along with that therapist, you can even switch to a new one at no additional cost. So basically, BetterHelp wants to make therapy more affordable and more accessible so that you can start living a happy and healthy life. It's really easy to sign up. All you need to do is go to this link, betterhelp.com/chesstalk. That's better, HELP. And using this link, you'll get 10% off on your first month. Link is in the description box below, so do check it out. Alright, so we've covered the classical lines and the Averbakh variation of the King's Indian. Now let's look at the Samisch variation, which starts with the move f3. Now the main reason why white goes for this is to bring out the bishop, bring out the queen, castle on the queen side and expand on the other side. He's hoping for us to castle on the king side so that he can launch a deadly attack against our king. So if we ever play e5, he will close down the center in order to launch a flank attack. With this idea in mind, let's look at what we need to do as black. Well, there are many ways to play against this, but let me show you how I like to go about it. So after f3, castles, bishop e3, I recommend you play c5, white locks down the center, you create a pawn break, queen d2, e takes, c takes, and that's how we end up in a modern Benoni type pawn structure. This is the type of setup I like to get into because the main advantage of going this way is that you can play this against many other variations, which I'll show you in a while. And plus, this Benoni type of a setup gives black a very solid position against the Samisch. From here, you just need to understand the main plans and you can play this very well in your own games. So if you look at this pawn structure, you will see that white has a pawn majority on the king side and black has a pawn majority on the queen side. So more often than not, both sides are looking to advance these pawns on their respective sides. So the key ideas for black are to play a6, b5 and then land this knight on e5. And if we cannot generate enough play on the queen side, then we have to fight for the center by playing f5 after moving the knight. Another thing you need to know is that there is a very important correlation between these two knights. Look, this white knight is quite problematic because of this pawn. It has to develop on very awkward squares. But the best square for this knight is actually f2. It allows f4 because it defends this e4 pawn. And also, the knight on f2 denies black from getting his own knight on g4. Because at any point, if white plays f4, this knight jumps in and it's very powerful since it dominates all these dark squares. So knight on f2 is very useful for white. Now many times as black, we randomly play knight to f7, which is not that great because it allows white to play knight h3 and after knight e5, he drops back to f2, which is ideally what he wants. Whereas instead of this, if you would have played a normal development move like rook to e8, that usually means that the white knight ends up getting stuck on some of these really unusual squares from where it can't contribute much. And this turns out to be a really fun game to play as black. You can exploit both sides of the board and there is a lot of room for creativity. Therefore, in this position, you should not play knight e7 immediately. Instead, just play c5. Now you might wonder, what if he takes on c5 because this pawn is also hanging? So after queen takes, rook takes, bishop takes, although we are down a pawn, it is still a fun game to play as black. You can maneuver your knights and utilize these beautiful dark squares to build pressure. On the other hand, white is generally struggling to develop and connect his rooks. Alright, now another quick sideline I want to show you in the Samisch is after c5, instead of pushing forward, white can choose to maintain the tension. So knight e2, knight c6, and after queen d2, you'll play e6. And once again, we have this beautiful layout. Here castles is the main line, but with queen a5, a6 and b5 is coming, so it's again very good to play as black. Therefore, white usually avoids castling and we transpose into one of the earlier variations and we reach a similar kind of a setup which we already discussed. So now that we've understood how to play this Benoni kind of a structure against the Samisch, it makes perfect sense to follow the same strategy against the 4 pawns attack. Now the 4 pawns attack starts with the move pawn to f4. White is going all in, but we don't have to change much. So after castles, knight f3, we again opt for the same move, c5. It's the same setup and this makes it much more easier for us to remember. Eventually, after takes, we end up with a similar kind of a Benoni pawn structure. The move orders could be a little different, but you need to understand the general strategy. So one of the key concepts of this kind of a setup is that you shouldn't mind trading your bishop for this knight, because the pawn structure is such that we are a little cramped for space. And since we've got less room to work with, if we can trade one pair of pieces like this, that allows better piece coordination between the other pieces. Say if you had the bishop here on c8, you can yourself feel how awkward that makes it for black. Okay, now a few more key ideas I want to emphasize. Firstly, you should look to have a rook on e8 because this allows you to keep a check on this e5 break. Secondly, you need to play for a6, b5, but almost always it's going to be denied by the simple pawn move a4. Also, you can use your queen along this diagonal and connect your rooks. And last but not the least, since the bishop has given up this diagonal, we often have the plan of pushing c4, getting the knight on c5, and then jumping up to d3 or b3. White, on the other hand, will stop you from doing all this and look for g4, g5, or even push for e5. So just keep all these plans in mind. Now let's move on to another sideline of the King's Indian, and that is when white goes for the Fianchetto variation. Bishop g2, d6, and after white plays knight f3, to keep it consistent, we'll go for the same setup as we saw in the other sidelines. So we will play c5, but before that, I would like to play knight to c6, inviting white to play d5. After this, we can place the knight on a5, and that's really useful. After c5, we've got the same pawn structure, and this knight holds a really good grip on the queen side. It keeps constant pressure on c4, and it also stops white from any queenside advancements like a3, because then the square on b3 becomes very weak. And in general, it also supports our overall plan of expanding on the queen side. So a6, b5, e6, the plans are all the same. It's just that the knight is adding additional pressure. So basically, after knight c6, if he attacks us, that just works in our favor. So sometimes he might try to delay the move d5. He'll make a few developing moves with the hope that you try to force things. You try to do something different, but you don't need to deviate from your plan. Let's say he castles, don't commit your knight, just hold on. And in the meanwhile, you can continue with your other main moves like a6 and b5. Basically, we are preparing in advance for the queenside expansion. Let's say he plays e4. Again, we can play rook b8 in order to support b5. Eventually, when he pushes d5, that's when you have to move the knight. And after that, you play c5, which arrives at the very same setup that you're comfortable playing with. For example, after bishop d2, you can even sacrifice a pawn. And after bishop a6, a4, knight b3, you end up with some really aggressive play on the queen side. So that's how you can deal with different variations of the King's Indian using the same type of setups. And once you play more games, you'll become much more confident playing this opening. All right, so it's puzzle time. In this position, it is white's turn and you need to find the best move for white. Share your answers in the comments. Let's see how many of you get this right. Guys, do subscribe to the channel and I shall see you in the next one.